Hi, everybody. Welcome to our whole meeting of the 14th of July, 2026. And we're very happy to have Dave Bloom with us again, the guru of community websites, who pioneered the amazing website of the Zimbabwe Jewish community, which has stimulated and made so much else happen. So Dave was born and raised in Zimbabwe, where he was head of Habonim during the early 70s when it was Rhodesia, made Aliyah in 1973. Over the years, he's volunteered with various non-profit organizations, including as chairman of Telfed SA, the SA Zionist Fed in Israel. Currently heads World Machal, and after leaving Reuters, he was a partner in a software company in the fintech industry for nearly 25 years, hence his ability to make websites. So thank you, Dave, for doing that. As the founder of Zimbabwe and Zambian Jewish community website, he's documented Jewish communities along with an active social media presence of over 100 video clips. Well, I'm sure you're going to tell us more about that today, Dave. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Just 1 second.
It's the F11 tech.
Yeah, but you've got now this notes or not?
No notes, but we've got the browser.
Okay, so I'll do the browser.
The F11 trick.
Yeah. So you've got the beginning of the first slide?
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, so thanks again, Geraldine. And really, again, I want to pay tribute to you and your work in bringing Chol together and helping many of us do our work in preserving the stories of Southern African Jewish communities. In part one, I gave sort of a history of the communities really from the late 19th century through to when each of the two countries became independent. And so this evening, I'm going to take the post-independence view, and towards the end, I'm going to spend a bit of time telling you really what's happening with them, these communities today after I visited for a couple of weeks in January, February this year. Please take note of any questions you have and keep them for the Q&A. And as Geraldine has pointed out, this series is recorded and will be available for sharing later. So, before moving into the post-independence period, I think it's useful just to remind ourselves what these Jewish communities looked like at their height. And this is just, I guess, a review of part one. So by the middle of the 20th century, there were established congregations, not only in Salisbury and Bulawayo, but in smaller communities such as the Midlands, Livingston, Lusaka, and the Copperbelt. These were organized communities with synagogues, schools, youth movements, welfare organizations, and social clubs. Included education, sport, charity, culture, and strong family networks. Jews also played an active role in the wider economy and society. They're involved in commerce and industry, as well as medicine, law, education, and civic life, including politics. In many towns, Jewish families were well known through their businesses, professions, and public service. The communities maintained close links with South Africa, Britain, and Israel. South Africa was especially important for religious leadership, for education, business connections, and family ties. Britain remained culturally influential as Rhodesia, Zambia were British colonies, while Israel became increasingly significant after 1948. At the same time, these communities existed within the colonial social order. Many Jews benefited from the relative security and opportunities available to whites, or to Europeans as they were known. even though some were uncomfortable with the racial discrimination and a few actually opposed it. So prior to independence, they were confident and well-established communities, but they were also closely tied to a political and social system that was about to change dramatically. So in this transition that we're talking about this evening, the question is how these communities responded when colonial rule ended and African majority government began. So basically, after independence, the Jewish communities, so the two countries now became, Zimbabwe and Zambia. We looked at the growth and the development of the Jewish communities during the colonial period, and this talk will be post-independence when Northern Rhodesia became Zambia in 1964, and Rhodesia became Zimbabwe in 1980. These political changes transformed the countries, but they also profoundly affected the Jewish communities living within them. The story that follows is not simply one of decline or disappearance. It's a story of adaptation, difficult choices, and changing forms of identity. Some Jews remained and continued to contribute to their countries. Others emigrated in search of security, education, employment, or larger Jewish communities. We will look at how political change, economic uncertainty, and demographic decline reshaped Jewish life in Lusaka, Harare, and Bulawayo. We will also consider the individuals who connected Jewish identity with African nationalism, such as Simon Zukas in Zambia. Finally, we will examine what has survived: synagogues, cemeteries, records, personal memories, and really a worldwide diaspora that still feels a deep connection. The central question of this talk is what has happened to the small Jewish community when most of the members leave. This part 2 will take us through 46 years of post-independence for Zambia and Zimbabwe. So Zambia's Jewish community entered the post-colonial period a full 16 years before Zimbabwe. This timeline helps to explain why the two Jewish communities entered the post-independence period at very different times. In 1964, Northern Rhodesia transitioned and became the Republic of Zambia under Kenneth Kaunda. This was quite a smooth transition. There was not serious violence. There were demonstrations prior to the transition and pressure from the nationalists of Zambia, of Northern Rhodesia, but it was on the whole a peaceful transition. For the Jewish community there, the transition from colonial rule to African majority government began relatively early and was, as I said, initially peaceful. Many Jews remained in Lusaka, Livingston, and Copperbelt and continued their businesses and professional lives. Only 1 year later, in 1965, the white minority government in Southern Rhodesia declared UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. This was under Ian Smith from Britain. This was not internationally recognized and led to sanctions and increasing political isolation. So during the 1960s and 70s, the conflict in Rhodesia intensified into a prolonged liberation war. This created uncertainty, military pressure, and growing immigration. Many Jewish families left during these years, especially for South Africa, Britain, Israel, and Australia. In 1980, following negotiations and internationally supervised elections, Zimbabwe achieved recognized independence under Robert Mugabe, became prime minister, and the country entered a new era of majority rule. The important point is that Zambia's Jewish community had already been adapted to independence for 16 years by the time Zimbabwe became independent. The two communities, therefore, faced very similar questions about identity, security, business, and belonging, but at different times and under very different political circumstances. So let's just begin with Zambia, where the Jewish community's response to independence ranged from active support to caution and uncertainty. So independence did not immediately end Jewish communal life in Zambia. While many in the broader white population felt uncertain about their future under Kenneth Kaunda's government, the Jewish community had varied responses. Some welcomed African majority rule and even actively supported the national struggle, whereas others feared political stability or Africanization. Independence did not trigger an immediate exodus or the sudden end of Jewish communal life. Many individuals chose to remain initially, continuing to run their businesses and practices. Over time, the government introduced economic policies such as the Mulungushi reforms, which was basically nationalization, and increased state involvement in the economy. These shifts, along with a push for greater African participation in employment and business, compounded by declining copper prices, which was really the core of the Zambian economy, gradually reduced opportunities for some Jewish-owned enterprises. Early on, the community benefited from strong bilateral relations between Zambia and Israel, which included active Israeli agricultural, technical, and development projects in the region. However, diplomatic attitudes shifted following the Middle East wars in 1967 and 1973. Eventually, Zambia severed formal ties with Israel. Lusaka had become the primary external headquarters for Zimbabwe's ZAPU political leadership under Joshua Nkomo, as well as a main command center for its military wing called ZIPRA. So there were major military camps and training centers were scattered around Lusaka and along the Zambezi River border facing Rhodesia. And there were crossing points that with lots of incursions from the Zambian side. And of course, Rhodesians retaliating. So the Jewish response to Zambian independence didn't really happen in one single way. Like other minority communities, it included people with different political views, personal experiences, and expectations for the future. Some Jews welcomed African majority rule and regarded independence as a necessary just end to colonial government. A small number actually actively supported African nationalism. The best known example is Simon Zukas, who opposed colonial rule and racial discrimination and became involved in Zambia's independent movement. His life demonstrates that a Jewish identity and support for African nationalism were not incompatible. Other Jews were more cautious. They feared that independence might bring political instability, changes to property rights, or policies of Africanization that would reduce the role of Europeans and other minorities in businesses and professions. For business owners, doctors, lawyers, and engineers and shopkeepers, the central question was whether they could still have a secure place in the new Zambia. Some began considering immigration, but many did not leave immediately. Don't forget, we're talking about a peak before independence of about 1,200 Jews in Zambia. So in the early years after independence, a significant number of Jews remained in Lusaka and in the Copper Belt. And the decline was gradual rather than sudden. The community continued, but over time, political change, economic pressures, and the departure of younger generations reduced its size. The main point is that the Jewish responses ranged from enthusiasm and active support to caution and uncertainty. The community was never politically or socially uniform. Let's just focus on Simon Zukas for a moment. And so in the years before Zambia achieved statehood in 1964, one of the few white men to stand up against the culture of white supremacy was a Jew, Simon Zukas. His schooling took him to University of Cape Town, where he studied civil engineering. His time there coincided with the inauguration of apartheid, which thrust him into radical student politics and inspired him to join the main nationalist movement, the African National Congress, and where he returned to Northern Rhodesia. He was active participant in the country's struggle for independence. He was eventually deported to Britain, but following statehood was invited in 1965 to return to the new country by President Kaunda. Jewish identity and African nationalism were not necessarily opposites. Others who supported the black majority rule included Anania El-Kaim, who supported the movement for the independence of Northern Rhodesia from the British Empire and were later recognized as freedom fighters. There were strong relations, as I said before, initially with Israel. There were active projects. Those ties were practical and collaborative. There was a diplomatic shift, as I mentioned, between 67 and 73, and the severing of the ties. And for the Jews, um, while more remote and lacking the extensive local Zionist institutions, um, the Jews often felt caught in a complex position, navigating their loyalty to Zambia alongside their enduring emotional attachment to Israel. So I mentioned the Mulungushi reforms announced in 1968 by President Kenneth Kaunda, which initiated a sweeping nationalization program that completely transformed Zambia from a liberal market economy into a state-controlled command economy. The result of that was really that the smaller communities in the copper belt, you can see in the area that I've ringed here, started to really disappear. Those families, those small communities were dependent on the mining industry, and that mining industry became nationalized and run by the government. The opportunities for business were sharply decreased. So there was more consolidation of the Jewish community in Zambia. They were consolidated mainly in Lusaka. The regional centers really disappeared. There were fewer members, fewer services available, and it was harder to sustain. For the remaining families, there was a small dedicated number of families, amongst them the Galoons, who had big farming business outside Lusaka, who took on the responsibility of maintaining the Lusaka synagogue and the cemetery. They did support visitors and former residents who would visit, but despite all these efforts, eventually the synagogues and certainly in the Copperbelt were sold, and if we fast forward till today, there really are only a handful of Jewish individuals left in Zambia. The proceeds from the sale of the Zambian synagogues and communal properties, including those of Lusaka, were donated to two major medical educational initiatives. And to the credit of the Council of Zambia, the Zambian jury, they split a $2 million fund from the sale between a medical school at the Copperbelt University in Ndola, Zambia, and the Tel Aviv University School of Medicine in Israel. Copperbelt University went to establishing a medical school in Ndola, and the first building erected at the school is named in honor of the Jewish community. At Tel Aviv University, the remaining half was given to fund academic collaborations with the Zambian University and improving one of the buildings at the medical faculty, but it included student exchanges and visits by health experts to Zambia. Aviva Ron has been closely involved in that program. So it really is, I think, to the credit of the Council of Zambian Jury that they plowed back some of the funds into the community in Zambia. Another beneficiary of the funds was the establishment of a Jewish museum located just inside Livingston. It's located in the Railway Museum in Livingston. I've been there a few years ago. It's a very nice exhibition which tells the story of the Zambian Jewish community, the early settlers who, of course, arrived in Livingston, and that's where the museum gets its name as being the Gateway Jewish Museum, because that was really the way the Jews arrived in Northern Rhodesia and Zambia. There are artifacts, personal letters, photographs, and ritual objects, and the display has been really done very well. So just to sum up, just to sort of, just to go back on Zambia, um, we're talking about by the you know today, basically there are just a handful of Jews in the country. I believe that I've not met, or I've not had any interaction. I believe there's actually a Chabad rabbi in Lusaka, and I guess that's for visitors who come through. And I also believe, just interestingly, that there's now a hotel on the Livingston side of the Victoria Falls that provides kosher meals. So if anybody wants a visit to the Victoria Falls and needs kosher accommodation, there is a hotel on the Livingston sign that has kashrut approval, I believe, from Rabbi Silberhoff. Sorry, from Rabbi Silberhoff. Okay, so let's now move over to Zimbabwe. And where was it immediately after independence in 1980? Many Jews had already left during the UDI years. Many young Jewish men who did not identify, I can put myself amongst them, with the minority rule, were eligible for army service, left the country. So whilst in the 1960s there were 7,000 plus Jews in southern Rhodesia and Rhodesia, by 1980 there were only 1,500. In 1987 it went down to 1,200. The present day, in 2016, there are fewer than 80 Jews remaining in both Harare and Bulawayo. It's very, very steep decline. So what were the Jewish reactions to independence in 1980 in Zimbabwe? For many, the end of the Rhodesian Bush War, as they called it, was a profound sense of relief that the violence and uncertainty of the conflict had finally ceased. Hope for reconciliation. There was widespread hope that the new government, through its public commitments to reconciliation, would succeed and foster a more stable, multiracial future. It was certainly the initial policy of the Zimbabwe government to a policy of reconciliation. Alongside this hope, there was palpable concern about personal security, the future of private property. I discussed that previously in the previous session, but certainly you'll hear about it going in the next few slides, and long-term economic prospects under the new administration. The transition also prompted internal reflection. Some members of the community felt moral discomfort regarding their position within the previous colonial order and the racial inequality of Rhodesian society. Despite the uncertainty, many Jews chose to stay, driven by a genuine desire to contribute their skills and energy to the development of the new Zimbabwe. And just a quick reminder of the map. You can see the area. Oops, sorry. What have I done? Yeah. Okay. You can see the map. So the map will show you that the area from Bulawayo to Gweru to Kwekwe, and you should see there. Well, the Tuma should also appear. But anyway, the three towns between Bulawayo and Harare were called the Midlands. That was Gweru, Kwekwe, and became Kadoma. It used to be called Gatuma. And those towns really started to dwindle. The small Midlands towns. So in the early 1980s, despite the political transition, the Jewish community in Zimbabwe did have robust and well-established infrastructure. The center of life, of course, around the shuls, the synagogues, and communal halls. But there was educational facilities, the Sharon School, primary school, the Palmer School in Bulawayo was still very active. My family were there in the late 80s and 89, and both our daughters went to school at Sharon School, wonderful school, very high standard. And there was still a significant number of Jewish kids in the school at that time. Other services like UJW, welfare organizations were still functioning. The sports clubs of Wingate and Parkview, I'm not sure when Parkview started to decline, but Certainly, Wingate continues to actually operate. And external ties were mainly with Israel and the broader South African Jewish community. But we're talking about really resilience for those who remained. The community did not simply vanish. It remained a functioning, organized entity during those early years of independence. So this is a video clip that I took in 1991. I'll just show it to you shortly, just sort of briefly. I hope you can see it clearly. This is the Sharon School speech night in 1991. There was still, as I said, quite a significant number of Jewish kids in the school. This was done. This ceremony was taking place in what was the Harry Margolis Hall, which was full. So you get a sense of that the community was still quite strong. There was still quite a large community, given that even though it had shrunk. There are individuals here that are on the stage, like Stan Harris, who was the president of the Board of Deputies at the time, which was still functioning. And the hall was full. So you really had a sense of a community that was functioning very well. I'm not going to show you the whole video. All these videos are on my YouTube channel, and you can watch them there. I'll send you links at the end, towards the end. But basically, Jewish immigration did start to accelerate in the 1980s. Many families had left, as I said, during UDI. One of the most important factors was education. Many Jewish families sent their children to universities in South Africa, Britain, Australia, Israel. And after graduation, these young people just did not return. So the small size of the Jewish community created social challenges for young adults who had limited opportunities to meet Jewish partners. Moving to countries with larger Jewish populations, therefore, offered not only educational and professional opportunities, but also the possibility of building a Jewish family. Economic uncertainty was another factor. Although the early years of independence were initially marked by optimism and reconciliation, there were growing concerns about the direction of the economy and the future of private business. And many families felt they were reluctant to wait until circumstances became so difficult before making a decision to leave. Political instability also became a concern. There was violence in the Matabeleland area around Bulawayo. A terrible massacre took place. It's called the Gukurahundi massacre. You can read about it online. Somewhere in the region of, I don't know, they say between 20 and 30,000 Matabeles were slaughtered by basically what was called the 5th Brigade, that were basically Shona, from the Shona tribe, from the area around Harare, who had been trained by North Korea. And they were sent down by Mugabe to basically put down any threat to his authority. And they did it brutally, which left a huge scar on the population around Bulawayo, around Matabeleland, and has remained a scar ever since. And of course, the dynamic between the main parties at the time, between the Joshua Nkomo side of ZAPU and the Mugabe ZANU party. But this weakened confidence in the country, and people were getting a bit nervous. South Africa was the easiest, most common destination, but I can tell you from my work with Telfed in Israel, we at one stage had over 800 Zimbabwean on our books here in Israel. So a significant number of the community proportionately did make Aliyah. Other important destinations included Britain, as I said, and Canada and the United States. The central point is that most families did not leave for one reason alone. I guess, same in Zambia. These decisions usually reflected a combination of educational, social, economic and political considerations. As immigration increased, the question was no longer simply how many Jews remained, but whether enough remained to sustain a complete communal life. By 1990s, there really was a serious loss of critical mass. The Jewish communities of Zimbabwe and, of course, Zambia had reached a point where decline began to accelerate. The problem was no longer one only that individuals, that families were leaving. The deeper issue was the loss of critical mass needed to sustain communal life. The remaining membership were becoming older, while there were fewer Jewish children and younger families. It made it increasingly difficult to maintain the Jewish schools, the youth groups, and regular educational activities. Religious life was also affected. Having a regular rabbi, I can tell you that from my recollection, up until about the late 1990s, there was a rabbi in both in Harare and in Bulawayo, but by the turn of the century, there were no permanent rabbis in the country. The communities became more and more dependent on visiting rabbis, hence the work of Rabbi Silberhoff that started to develop. And they helped to maintain religious and educational life. So the main point is that the loss of critical mass really created a chain reaction. Fewer people meant fewer services. Fewer services made the community feel less attracted to younger families, and that in turn encouraged further immigration. Now into the 2000s, the turn of the century, really was a sort of a watershed for Zimbabwe, and it entered a real severe political and economic crisis. With really the beginning of the fast-track land reform program, under which many large commercial farms were taken over and redistributed. This triggered a whole sequence of economic problems for the country. The best agricultural land had been controlled by a relatively small number of white farmers, but they had been incredibly successful in maintaining the economy and had been holding up the economy, basically. But the speed and often violent manner of the farm occupations caused major disruption. Many experienced farmers and farm workers were displaced, investment declined, and the country's ability to produce and export food was badly affected. There was increasing opposition, especially from the newly formed Movement for Democratic Change. But the Liberation War veterans also played a prominent role in the farm seizures. So there was really quite a lot of chaos politically in the country. The decline in agriculture was accompanied by wider economic collapse, government spending, falling production, international isolation. Prices rose so quickly that salaries and savings lost their value almost immediately. Ordinary transactions became difficult. You can see the image of one of the many notes that were printed in that period. This is a $10 billion note that was produced in Zimbabwe. It could not buy a loaf of bread. There were shortages, fuel and electricity were in shortage, and many businesses closed. They could not cope with the inflation. For the already small Jewish community, this new wave of departures had an especially serious effect. The loss of a few families and professionals and community leaders would weaken the synagogue and welfare system and social organizations. At the same time, Zimbabwe did not become completely isolated from Israel. Some Israeli businesses and agricultural, security, or technical companies, computer companies continued to operate in the country, and in certain cases, they brought Israeli staff or specialists to Zimbabwe for limited periods. These temporary residents occasionally added to Jewish communal life, attendant services, but they did not replace the permanent families who had immigrated. The main point is that the crisis of the 2000s affected all sections of Zimbabwe society. However, because the small Jewish community was already so small, the demographic and institutional impact on our Jewish life was particularly severe. So this is now we jump for fast forwarding to my visit in 2026 in January, February. And this is now a short clip that I did of Sharon's school. And okay, so let's just give you a very short sense of how the school looks today. Um, it is quite confusing and surprising for many people that in 2026, the Sharon School in Harare and the Carmel School in Bulawayo, both schools maintain Jewish traditions. There are no children, Jewish children in those schools. You can see that the makeup of the school has changed dramatically. Um, there are even, um, I saw from many different ethnic groups in the school, Chinese, Indian, mostly black, local black, um, obviously from well-to-do families. These are private schools, but they do maintain um, a Jewish tradition. And this is Carmel School. I'm just going to show you briefly a group of girls that I filmed. So you get again, these kids are getting Jewish education in a limited level. Um, sorry, I'm just going to stop that. Um, the um, Both principals that I spoke to of the schools told me that they prefer to keep um, the Jewish tradition of the schools. They say that it differentiates themselves from other schools, private schools, that it maintains a sort of an image of quality, and they are really good, high quality schools by any international standard. Um, and there are, well, certainly in the Bulawayo um, uh, school, there's no involvement of the Jewish community in the school itself. The board is run by non-Jews, and the community has hardly any involvement other than renting out the buildings to that board of education. In Harare, a member of the Jewish community, or a few members of the Jewish community, are still on the board of the Sharon School, but it will eventually be taken over, I guess, in the same model as has been done in Bulawayo. Other bits, little clips that I took and I want to share with you. I mentioned, of course, the amazing safari community in Harare. This is just a short video clip of. Sorry, I'll just go back again, and no, previous. Try and show you. Sorry, it's giving me a bit of a hassle here. Okay, so this is just taken a video from overlooking inside the Sephardic Hebrew Congregation Synagogue in Harare, immaculately kept. Services are held alternative Shabbats in this shul and in the Ashkenazi shul, which I'll show you shortly. But neither of the communities can maintain minyan on their own. So they have to merge and they have to share prayer services. The next slide, the next video is also, this is now the Ashkenazi shul. Also beautifully maintained. This it's an interesting story. This shul was built it was opened in 1977. So if you think about the timeline, 1977 was really towards the end of Rhodesia. By 1980, Zimbabwe became independent, and this was really when the community had started a real serious decline. So the timing of building of this shul, well, one can discuss it, but it remains very well kept. So as I was saying on the recording, sorry, it's jumping around a bit. On the recording, I mentioned that that there were 11 men in shul when I went to the shul that includes the Safari community. 11 men in shul on that Shabbat. The next clip I'm going to show you is where the Bulawayo shul, which is a hall or really a combination. It was originally the progressive synagogue in Bulawayo many years ago. The progressive shul had shut down, but unfortunately in 2003 there was a major fire which burnt the main shul in Bulawayo, and this is now where they hold their shul services on a Friday night. They only have on Friday night a service, and there are about 15 men in Bulawayo, so they really do struggle to maintain a minyan. Raymond Roth is a real stalwart here, and he really keeps things together. Some of the content, the Torahs, was saved from the fire and are in this hall, in this shul. And they have managed to maintain basic services here since then, since 2003. These were all saved from the fire and are now in this Sinai hall. Okay, moving on. I also visited the main cemeteries in Bulawayo and in Harare. Warren Hills is in Harare. It was opened in 1967. The original Pioneer Street cemetery I also visited. My grandparents are buried there. But what I've managed to do over the years is actually have records taken of all the cemeteries of Zimbabwe and of Zambia. There are 15 Jewish cemeteries altogether, and I have them on the ZJC website. I'll show that to you shortly. All are kept in pristine condition by the local communities. I'll show you shortly a tour of that. Again, in Bulawayo, Raymond Roth takes care of the funerals and ensures the cemetery is kept in immaculate condition. In Harare, Bertie Bondi heads the Chevra Kadisha, which looks after both the Pioneer Street and the Warren Hill Cemetery. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on that again. All these video clips are on my YouTube channel. In Harare, the Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews share services, as I mentioned. It serves also, of course, Jewish visitors who come to Harare regularly and travelers. And it's significant for these visitors that the services are maintained. So in Bulawayo, I'd say that, it's an especially important place in the history of Zimbabwe Jewry. So synagogue, cemetery, and the communal buildings really represent a rich historical legacy. But the current community, as I mentioned, is extremely small and very difficult for them to function. Um, Harare, so Harare remains the main functioning center, I would say, of Jewish life, while Bulawayo remains a powerful center of memory, heritage, and identity. Um, as the Jewish population in Zimbabwe has declined, the care of the cemeteries has become one of the community's most important responsibilities. Many residents now live overseas with their with their parents or grandparents remaining in Zimbabwe. Um, there's also a need to preserve marriage and burial and synagogue records, which I've been doing on the ZJC website. Marriage certificates, burial registers, um, and of course family stories and biographies of families who made their lives in those two countries. I interviewed quite a few people while I was on that visit, and you can see I think I did nearly 20 interviews of the community, quite a high proportion of the remaining community. I did interview when I was there, and you can see those interviews on the YouTube channel. So I have been working on digitizing as much as possible and trying to help preserve the story of the JC. And I do have a detailed blog of my visit in January and February on the website, which I'll show you when I show you the website. So whilst the communities have become smaller, the history in the community is becoming, I'd say, more accessible than ever. And people are happy to share on the ZJC Facebook group a lot of both nostalgia and current events amongst the former and current members of the community. Okay, so I'm going to head to wrap up now, but just again to remind you that we are in a phase of really dwindling communities, and the question is, how do we maintain the connections? How do we maintain the story? And I'm going to show you shortly how that is being done. I want to just briefly mention the Lemba community, which I did visit when I was in Harare. It's an interesting story. Genetic studies of the Lemba, of their paternal ancestry, has found significant Middle Eastern connections. Although genetics cannot by itself establish identity or prove direct descent from ancient Israelites, Professor Tudor Parfitt has done significant research on the Lemba, claiming they may have originated from Sana'a in Yemen, which is one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities. The Lemba of Southern Africa have a rich oral tradition of migrating from a city called Sena. So the link to Sana'a is there. I did visit them. They do have this, you can see the kind of practices that they have, which are very close to the Jewish religion. But there are many other tribes in Africa. Those of you who know the story of the Yoruba in Nigeria, the House of Israel in Ghana, the Abu Yadaya of Uganda, Bet Israel, of course, of Ethiopia. There are many examples, but the Lemba are of a particularly interesting one because of that, also quite controversial, but definite genetic history. This is a short video clip I had of gentleman who runs this is Modric Maraserera, who actually runs the community, the Lemba community. And you can hear he's done a full conversion to Judaism in America. And this is his...
We can't actually hear, or I can't hear anything on the videos.
You can't hear?
No, I don't know if anybody else can.
I don't know if other people can hear, but he's basically reading from the Siddur. I'm not going to try and solve that now, Geraldine.
No.
But he reads from they have a Shabbat service. He told me that that day that I came, they had about 50 people for Shabbat services. They've got a Aron Kodesh. They've got a Torah. They've got a building in Harare where they meet every week, and there are roughly 30 to 40,000 Lemba in Zimbabwe. Okay, I'm going to wrap up, and this is just basically to remind you that the ZJC website, um, which has many hundreds of pages and many thousands of images, searchable records for the cemeteries, family biographies, and of course we have a very active Facebook group um, of the ZJC. You can check out the ZJC YouTube channel, which has well over 100. It's now around about 120 video clips, and some of them I've shown you this evening. And I thought I would just try and show you. Well, I don't know if I can show you briefly the website, or can I? I have to go out of the full screen, and I'll just show you briefly the Zimbabwe website. Can you see the screen with the browser?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the website. What I've done in the last 6 months is built a much more efficient way of searching on the cemeteries using AI. And basically now we have a collection of 2,675 graves from 15 cemeteries. And these are locations of the cemeteries. And you can search. And I want to show you just one example, just to give you an indication of what a record looks like. If I can, I'm going to search. I'm going to pull up my grandfather and show you what a record can look like. Philip Bloom. I've scanned and digitized all the inscriptions, so you can also find any wording on the inscriptions can be searched on. Well, it's taking a bit of time because of the Zoom to load. Here's the record, and basically, come on. Sorry about that. Oh, gosh, nothing. It's just because of the. Yeah, here we are. Can you see the image now?
Yes.
Okay. So this is my grandfather who was buried in the Pioneer Street cemetery in Harare. This is the inscription both in Hebrew and in English. And you can register and you can share a memory of that person. So I've done a write-up about Philip Bloom, his basic biography. I've put up a couple of photographs about him. And I'm encouraging people who are on this call, if you have relatives in the Zimbabwe and Zambian community, please register on this new cemetery site and tell the story of those people. Other than just looking at the gravestone, we know nothing about them. So if you can put up a picture, and you can also create an annual USCORE reminder. So these are features that are built into the new cemetery site. But also, if you look across the other menus, I've got a lot of material on Zambia, individual family records, history. I've got books. The famous Majuta book has been scanned and put on here. A Rhodesian Jury by Eric Rosenthal, a full book. There are 2 full books on the history of the Zambian and Zimbabwe Jewish community. Mainly about the Rhodesian community that have been scanned and are readable on the website. On the media side, I've got a blog, and that blog is where you can find the full report of my recent visit in January, February 2026. So in that way, I'm going to wrap up, and I hope it's given you a bit of a kind of a taste of where we are today in those 2 countries. And I'm really happy to take questions. There are a lot of other things I'd love to show you, but I think time has run out on me, and I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to
Well,
you,
thank you,
Geraldine.
Dave, for a most comprehensive and insightful look at what's happened since independence. I'm sure there are people who want to make comments or say something. So do put either your real hand up or your yeah, okay, Giddy Shimoni, unmute yourself, Giddy, and then you can see what you want to say to us and to Dave. Did you have to unmute first? Do you know how to do that? Bottom left, if it's on a computer, click the little microphone. Unfortunately, I can't unmute you.
I
You
think you
go down
can, Geraldine. I think you can.
I can't. No,
Um,
I can try.
if you click on the, hang on, where's Giddy?
I can't. Okay, Giddy, you've done it.
Yes, yes. Hi, Dave.
Hi.
Dave, what I find intriguing, and I'd very much like you to tell us more, what is the rationale in the schools for conducting them in a Jewish manner? How does
Yeah.
the Jewishness factor express itself in practice? And why on earth should pupils who come from non-Jewish backgrounds, presumably many of them Christian of some sort backgrounds, or syncretist forms of Christianity, why should they be subjected to Jewish symbols? How is this accepted? What is the rationale?
Well, Giddy, I found I was also blown away when I saw it myself, but I have to tell you that it has changed over the years. It's become what I showed you there in those clips. Those two clips, one of Carmel and one of Sharon. Basically the sum of it is they have a kiddush every Friday morning. They used to have Hebrew studies. They used to have Hebrew language studies in the schools. They no longer have that. So the whole sum of you call it the Jewish content of their schools is centered around Kiddush on a Friday. There's a chap there in Harare called Yossi Kabli. He's an Israeli. He's been there for many years. He used to be a teacher at the school, and he gives him the Kiddush. He does the Kiddush and the bracha. The rationale, as you asked, is to do with the fact that the schools, the boards of the schools, sort of feel not sort of they told me very very straight. They prefer that the schools maintain their Jewish sort of aura, if you want to call it. They maintain a kind of a brand of quality, and they differentiate themselves from other schools. For example, in Harare, there is a Greek school, which is also a very good school, private junior school in Harare. And there is a similar story. The Greek community set it up for their community. It was based around Greek Orthodox sort of principles, but there are hardly any Greeks left, and they maintained it as a Greek school. So it's a difficult one to explain, but that was what I was told. They don't. I wouldn't say they spend a lot of time educating the kids on Jewish rituals or Jewish ethics or anything like that. It's basically summarized around a single prayer on the Kiddush of Friday morning. And I asked Yossi Kabli, and he basically said to me, listen, I give them call it Parashat Shavua, which is a generic Parashat Shavua. It could be applicable to any of the ethnic groups that are at the school. He doesn't focus particularly on a Jewish theme, although he does give he gives what you call a Parashat Shavua. It's really much more of he's described it much more as a generic lesson that he gives the kids. And they're happy to make, it's not that they're being, there's no one who's forcing them, there's no, what's the word? Coercion of Jewish essence, Jewish studies or anything like that. It's more of an image they want to maintain. and everybody's happy with it, Giddy. It's a strange thing to hear those kids singing Hatikva. And I asked them, do you know what the words mean? And they said, yes. And they did tell me they did translate some of the words. They knew what the words of Hatikva were. So it's quite interesting.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting.
I'm sorry you guys couldn't hear the sound. I understand you couldn't hear the sound of those clips. I'm sorry about that. But if you do go onto the YouTube channel, you will find all those clips and you'll be able to listen to them.
Uh-huh. We weren't sure until we saw the little girl singing that we were supposed to hear.
Okay. Okay. So, okay.
Well,
anyone else?
Anybody else like to say something?
So I see a request from Eleanor Brenner on the chat. Do I have any information about the Golden family? So I'm not going to go into specifics now, but I'm happy to take questions from you by email or WhatsApp. If you want to make contact with me, send me your email. My email.
Dave, can I say something? You mentioned we talked about ANU before, and you said that you've looked there and all they've got on Southern Africa is what?
No, I was talking about Zimbabwe. I couldn't say. I was looking particularly for what they have in Zimbabwe at the ANU Museum. And I was surprised. And I'm talking about a few years ago. I haven't been back, but this was a few years ago. They had a display, and all it had on that display about Zimbabwe was the Lemba community. They had nothing about what I've just told you.
So I think between you, Dave, and Giddy, I think that we need to enlighten the people at ANU who are looking at the diaspora of Jewish life, that there is a very rich vessels of Jewish life in Southern Africa, and we'd very much like to connect with them to see how we can mutually be good for each other.
Can I say something about this, Geraldine? Because
yes, please.
I tell you, personally, I have a sense of frustration over things of this nature, because I was largely responsible as the chief academic advisor for ANU for this fact that the country from which I come, South Africa, not to speak even of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, doesn't have anything, at all about it. But I must tell you, there are many, many communities in the world that would say the same thing. It's not small communities. The essence of work on a museum of the totality of the Jewish people in historical terms is an exercise in tremendous, what we call in Hebrew, tzimtzum, how to say in very few words and very few artifacts and very few descriptions, of the history narrative. It's an enormously difficult task to bring it down to that minimum of minimum. And in the course of building a museum like that, you simply cannot afford to devote space that will have any significance at all to small communities like that. And even South African Jewry hasn't. But you must remember that the museum itself has many changing exhibitions, in addition to that permanent exhibition. And in the past, for example, years ago, I was also the academic advisor for a complete exhibition only on South African Jewry, which included the publication of a catalogue with the history and so on. This is maybe 30 years ago. So from time to time, small communities can have something that's not a temporary, complete hall of exhibition on the communities. And that's the decision that we made in planning the vast Anu Museum was that that's the solution. That there will be, at one time there was an idea to try and incorporate in the Anu Museum. I can tell you this is a long process. I worked with them for 10 years in the building of the museum, and many ideas were invented in this regard. One of the ideas that I tried to make was that there should be sections of the Anu Museum that will have the small museums in various countries that you can see in Anu. If you see what I mean, a video of, for example, the South African Jewish Museum, or similarly that small museum that you showed, Dave, in Bulawayo.
No, in Livingston.
In Livingston, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was an idea that you would have some rooms in which you can actually see other museums in the main museum. Yeah. But in the end, it wasn't workable in terms of what you could fit into a museum, which, as it is the biggest Jewish museum in the world. Three full stories. It takes you days to go to this museum. So that's,
okay.
Don't think that this wasn't discussed, and don't think that I personally was awfully frustrated. I said to them on one occasion, I said, do you think how will I answer people from the country, the community that I come when they say, what on earth did you do that you didn't put South Africa in anywhere?
Okay, I think that from my point of view, Giddy, what I would hope for is that now that they're established, that somewhere there is a study room, that if somebody walks into Anu and says, I want to know about South Africa, they'll say, look, go to this computer and look at Hol.
Yes, that I think is workable and feasible and to some extent exists, but I don't know too much about it. You know, how that, just as there is a room where you can look up your name and trace family and so on. Yes, absolutely. That's a partial solution. Yeah. But to get it, it's still very frustrating.
Okay. Well,
a community like South African Jewry
I think we can take this offline.
And I always feel bad about it personally.
Thanks. Mervyn Davidovitz.
I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
My question really is about capacity building and organizational development, because this problem that they have in Zimbabwe is just like a very small kind of manifestation. I mean, for example, in India, they have the exact same problems of these very well-resourced communities that were immense, incredible communities, struggling with the exact same problems, like 4 or 5 people standing there holding the fort, and people, property developers, and in other places in Eastern Europe as well, often there's the issue about someone in the community being the last person, selling out the assets of the community, corruption. It's quite a common kind of problem. And so my question really is, for example, in Lithuania, there's like so many, and in other parts of Eastern Europe, there's so many cooperative projects that are put together where those shuls or schools or whatever it was are actually recycled in some way that keeps part of memory and also has a functional here and now kind of ongoing commitment. And I'm just wondering, Giddy, in particular, since you in this, whether there is any specific programs that is focusing on countries, I mean, all over the world, where they actually can share resources and manufacture centers of memory that are viable on an ongoing basis and not dependent on, the last 3 or 4 people that in that community to hold it, and then the whole place just gets auctioned. So, I mean, in essence, I'm asking whether there is some kind of organizational capacity building.
So I'd like to answer that, and if I may keep it specific to Zimbabwe and Zambia, as I've spoken about this evening. I do believe there is a need for, what I call estate planning. I call it, eventually these communities are going to probably disappear. And someone does have to think about how do they deal with both the posterity of these, but also the actual physical elements, assets that are there. And I really, I've tried to engage the community in Zimbabwe. What they did in Zambia, I think, was terrific. That they donated, they sold the shul, they donated. It was totally transparent. They donated half the money to the medical school in Ndola and half the money to the medical school in Tel Aviv. And they built the Gateway Museum in Livingston. I think those were very kind of significant and ethical ways of winding down those communities. I hope it'll be the same in Zimbabwe, and I'm trying to maintain a dialogue with the community on those issues. I can't talk about the world, the wider world, and the sort of questions that you've asked. I'm talking about specifically Zimbabwe and Zambia. And yes, it's a problem for, I think, in many South African small communities that have also kind of disappeared. There is a question from Jonathan Mark on the
That, yes.
yeah.
Was the Jewish community subject to anti-Semitism after liberation?
Look, Jonathan, I can't say if you're still there. I can't say there was any direct incidents of anti-Semitism, but I mentioned this in part one of my talk. The Jewish community always did feel as slightly outsiders. They were not, certainly in the colonial days, they were not welcome in certain areas, particularly sports clubs, and hence they built their own Jewish sports clubs. There were incidents. I grew up there and I never experienced any anti-Semitism growing up. I was at a government school in Harare. I never experienced any anti-Semitism. But there were some incidents, and I'm not going to go into them now, but there were incidents. I wouldn't say it was a pervasive problem in the country. Jews were involved in many aspects of the economy, of civic society, but there was certainly an element of call it anti-Semitism in certain spheres. The Bulawayo Club, for example, there was a special sort of a snotty club called the Bulawayo Club, which did not allow Jews. Things like that.
Mm-hmm.
After liberation, I can't say there was any significant change either.
Yeah. Okay, well, interestingly enough, next week we'll be talking to Rabbi Silberhaft, and he's the one who has probably wound up more synagogues than anybody else we know of the work that he's been doing all over the country and looking after the cemeteries. He's written a book, and now he's written a sequel to his book called Travels Continue, and he will be talking next week with not Jonathan Sachs, he's not
Dave
so long past. David Sachs, yes, who actually wrote the book with him or for him. So they'll be talking about their work next week, and it will cover many communities that are in the same situation as the communities you've mentioned today, Dave, in Zimbabwe.
Right.
And
right. I just want to mention, Geraldine, I put my email on the chat. I would like Doreen Ellenbogen, if you could please look at my email on the chat and send me a note. I'd like to exchange a few messages with you. But if any of you have any other questions, you can take my email. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, so it's Dave Bloom without any dots, and it's at outlook.com. And also, my email address because I email you, and I can always transfer messages to anybody that's on our list. So please keep in touch. It's lovely. You send out hundreds of emails, and it's just lovely when you get a few responses, even just to say thank you. Otherwise it just like disappears into the ether, and you don't know whether it's reached anybody or not. But of course, it's been lovely to see you all today. Lovely, Dave, to hear all this and reconnect and rekindle and understand what's happened to those lovely communities. So thank you very much. Thank you, Giddy, for being with us. Thank you, everybody who's come to listen. And do come along next week as well. We'll really look forward to seeing you. And then we'll leave you alone until we decide at some stage to do something else. So if you've got some ideas of what you'd like Hol to do, or what you'd like to do, or offer to do something, you know, Hol is a platform. It's your platform to do something. And I think that the, you know, the energy is there. So thank you all for what you're doing. And look at the whole website, because that's another thing, you know, we just don't know how many people actually click through to the website. There's great stuff there, including the Zimbabwe Jewish community. You've got a communities page, there's 61 communities, including Zimbabwe. So you can find it all there in one place. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Geraldine.
See you next week.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you so much.